Today, we are in conversation with Shivani Gupta, who is an ownpath mentor and the lead for behavioral science and design at Fractal Dimension. She has a highly cross-functional role where she works closely with stakeholders across behavioral and data sciences, human-centered design, business consulting, and more. Her practice is dedicated to deeply understanding and designing for better decision-making across human experiences, to build solutions that are past-informed, present-relevant, and future-ready. Let's go. How has your experience been so far with ownpath, and what made you choose to do this even?
So I personally feel that whenever I've tried to teach someone what I know, I realize how much I don't know about it. So I always try to get out there and meet people who are a little more fresh in their career than I might be, and try to share some of what I've learned and just see how much I understand it as well. And very often it's the questions that come from them that make you really think hard about things you've kind of assumed to be true. So yeah, it's always nice to have your worldview in a professional sense challenged, and that's why when I spoke to Shreyas and other people from OnePath, it felt like the right thing to do. This is my second year with them, and I hope there'll be many more.
Is there anything that you've learned that stood out for you that you would like to share with me?
I mean, I've always known that there's more than one way to look at a problem. But I think just when especially when you share a design brief with, say, 12 people, and they're split into a couple of groups, you realize just how many ways, one sentence in your brief can be interpreted, and how, what you thought was like, okay, this is a problem and this is pretty straightforward. It was a well-written brief, and, I thought it was a well-written brief. I checked it with a couple of people, and I think just seeing how different people internalized it, because of their context, because of their background, whom they spoke to that week, which group they were put into, which apps they use, which products they like, and just seeing how they took that apart, what they made of it, was really, really interesting to me. And so it was, I guess, the whole idea of diversity that everyone talks about so much, just seeing it come to life many times over in the course of just 2 weeks. So that was really exciting for me.
That does sound very interesting. Um, you're talking about like how it's sort of your lecture or something that you put out there sort of turned into something else, right? I want to know more about how did you like prepare for your lecture itself, which seemed to be like a raving point for a lot of people. Like, what?
um, yeah, I think the prep for it. So, I mean, of course, if behavioral science is quite an academic subject. People treat it in a very sort of high flown, sometimes jargon heavy way. So I think the prep had a lot to do with breaking down these really high strung concepts like emotion and feeling and action tendencies and behavior and drivers and things like that we kind of deal with on a day-to-day basis, even in our personal lives. Like, you don't have to be a behavioral scientist to know that emotions play a role in your decisions. But I think taking that idea and bringing it into something that was applicable for this cohort was something that all my work went into, and trying to find real life examples. So here what I tried to do was not just find professional and career examples, and consulting case studies and corporate examples of these principles, but also try to find them in like real life, right? So pick moments that you and I would have shared, something as simple as like how you felt when you missed a flight. What went into that? Were you on a work trip or a personal trip? Was it your fault? Was it traffic? So all of that can really encapsulate the idea of blame, right? And then if you take that to a social problem, then you're looking at it at a much larger scale. So there's all these different very big ideas of, like I said, emotion, feeling, action, decisions, and all of that coming into something that was applicable for them. So that's where I spent all my time trying to find these examples.
And how much time did that take you? Like, how long did you like the prep went on for?
I think, yeah, I'm just trying to think, probably like sporadically. So I'm someone who tends to do a lot of things at a time. And they usually feed into each other. So it'll be, I'll be doing something completely different. And then I'll think of an example for this. So I think over the course of 2 weeks, I would say, it was pieced together. And then, of course, right at the last minute, there was like a big chunk. So I think my preparation started with, making notes, talking to Shreyas, talking to Shrika, talking to a couple of other designers that I know who are at a similar stage in their career, people that I mentored probably at work more, and just understanding what has been the most useful thing they've learned from behavioral science and what is most applicable for them in their work life. So kind of taking notes about that, making like a structure, making a plan, sharing that with Shreyas and the team, then getting into finding all these examples, tweaking it a bit. And then of course the last rush, the, night before, where you put it all together and, figure out how much time you're going to spend and what the icebreaker activity is going to be and all the fun stuff that happened last minute. But yeah, it was probably about over 2 weeks sprinkled into the session.
Very interesting. There was also this big resource set that you sort of let out. Did you also prep it during that time?
Yeah, so some of them I do have, like, in my notes app, I do have them saved, because there are times when on LinkedIn someone will just ask you, hey, I'm someone who's interested in behavioral science. And I think unfortunately with behavioral science, there are a couple of books that seem to be propagated a lot, like Nudge and Thinking Fast and Slow, and the whole community will kill me for saying, like, you don't have to read the whole book. You don't have to read the book, to be honest, because they are, again, very esoteric, very concept heavy, right? So of course, if you're interested in that kind of thing, you can read it. But what I was trying to do with this resource list was give people different modules to study, right? So now you may be an auditory learner and someone else may learn better from visuals, and someone else may really enjoy podcasts. So I try to just sprinkle, like, if you want to read the articles and the technical work, then that was there. If you wanted to read something a little more fun and from designers who've experienced it, I put in some of those. Then there was a couple of Netflix documentaries and TV shows that I thought some of them might have already seen. And finally, I put in some games, which were like experiential games that you could kind of play and figure out the concepts for yourself. So I think the idea was really just to give them as many senses as possible and as many options to be like, hey, if you feel like this is too heavy for you, start with this, and then find a more approachable way to cope with this. So yeah, it was a little bit of stuff I had from before, and then like just kind of reflecting on things that I found useful as well. And then putting that down into some sort of structure, which I hoped would help.
Dude, I wish you were teaching me. Like,
please.
No, seriously, like, it sounds so utopian. Like that's how you want teachers of the world to be, like, putting in so much effort. Like, because I remember when we were in college, in the best of colleges did not have like teachers who would actually devote so much time and put all of these things together and just prep for these sessions that you're doing. So I just wanted to ask, like, what's your take on that? Like, traditional schooling versus alternative schools, something like that. What ownpath is alternative?
Yeah, having studied in a very traditional environment, I was both in Chennai and in Bombay, and I was in like very regular schools. And the whole focus, I think, over there was memorization, right? They were always teaching you to remember something, like whether it was, quote from memory, which when I talk to, people in America, they're like, what are you talking about? What is this quote from memory thing? Right? And they don't know. And I think it's really interesting because all my life, I think the entire schooling life was very much focused on internalizing, just remembering, actually not internalizing rather. And I think as you realize that that's not the most applicable in the real world, because I think we used to mug up, if that's a word you're familiar with, mug up even math problems, right? And there's no logic. You don't learn logic, you don't learn processing, you don't learn meaning. It's just sort of like, as long as you know the thing, it's fine, but you don't actually have to understand the thing, right? And I think when I went, my college years were really good. I would say we did have a fair balance of theory and practical. when it was psychology. But I think my real exposure to alternate education and just learning different ways of learning was probably during my masters, because while I was learning behavioral science in my masters, I was also doing performance poetry, which was completely different, right? They were completely different styles. And I think just learning about how the arts approach it versus academics approach it in a different country, in a very different context, I think gave me some exposure to just focusing more on inferences and meaning and rationale and your personal understanding. I think all came from there. And then as I got more into design, right, you realize that there are so many versions. There's like a spectrum of everything. And then the more you get into that, of course, there are many layers to explore, and it's a much longer conversation. But I think mainly what it gave me was that it's not just about, like, memorizing is a good skill. It's a good skill to have. I definitely benefit from it as a researcher. But when it comes to applying something, you have to understand it. It has to have personal meaning to you. And I think that's what alternate education and alternate forms have created, right? It's personal relevance, it's personal meaning. There's something of me in what I'm studying, as opposed to just you giving me things and me trying to accept them as the truth and learn them for what they are. So I think that involvement of the student and of the self, and oftentimes like a collective group, right? Most alternate educations don't happen one-on-one. So I think that aspect of the personal and collective self is very different, and probably what makes it much more enriching, even though the other may be more informative at some times. I think this is much more useful and much more, yeah, like good for your soul and good for your mind at the same time.
I totally agree with you. Like I could resonance, like I could feel everything you were saying, because it's like a lot of our lives was about memorizing things and not embodying the knowledge. And it is
Yeah.
about embodying what you know. And also like the fact that not spoon-fed people, because everybody's unique and they have their own approaches to what's to come.
Yeah.
You leave that space for exploration as well. So I really like that idea. Is there anything memorable from the cohort that you would like to share with? This is my last question, so anything?
Okay. So I think for me, what was really memorable with this cohort was that I felt they had really strong identities, right? And I don't know if it's COVID context that has like sped that up for a lot of us, or the fact that we're all spending that much more time with ourselves that's brought it out. But I really felt I don't know if the right word is touched, but I really felt touched by the fact that everyone was so honest and so vulnerable in the space. And it's not easy. We were all strangers. They didn't know me, I didn't know them. But it really felt like a lot of people brought their full attention, their full selves to the room, and didn't hold back in that sense. They weren't shy, they weren't um, afraid to just speak what they were thinking and what was on their mind. And I thought that was a really powerful energy to bring, because it not just meant that they could ask me things that were uncomfortable, but also share things that maybe they were struggling with.
Yeah.
And I think it's really beneficial to a group. It's really beneficial to the mentor, because otherwise, again, you're getting into that traditional zone where people are just taking face value, and like, I'm no authority, right? Maybe I have a little more experience, maybe I've studied this a bit more or applied it a bit more, but at the end of the day, all these concepts are fluid, and it only works if someone is kind of challenging me on what I'm thinking. So I think that was the best part of it for me.
That's so beautiful. And I think one of the things is like you can only be vulnerable with people who make that space for vulnerability. It's true. It's true. It's like if you, some people have a talent to hold space. Not everybody can hold space for others, right? So it's the energy that you create, and then they can sort of also submerge themselves in it. So I think it has a lot to do with you. You girl.
Like a really feel good session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank
But
you.